Hey everybody! In this video, I'm going to be sharing audio samples from a speaker shootout I recently did using the Mojo Tone 5E3 Tweed Deluxe that I built. This is a classic amp model and I was very interested to see which speaker would sound best in it. The video is divided into the following sections, all of which you can access easily from the table of contents. First, I'll give a quick overview of the 7 speakers I tested. In the second section, I give a quick description of the guitars and audio clips that I used for the shootout. Next is the full-length shootout, including 1-minute unprocessed clips, a total of 28 clips. That's 4 different audio samples times 7 different speakers. After that is what I call the lightning round, where you can listen to short, back-to-back snippets of sections from each sample, alternating through all the speakers, which is great for rapid comparison. I'll wrap up with a quick commentary and some opinions about what I thought were the best speaker choices for this amp. And finally, bonus material for anyone who's a 5E3 enthusiast, a quick overview of the mods that I've done to the amp and my opinions on their usefulness. Alright, let's get started. Before I started this project, I had a Weber 12A125A and a Celestion Vintage 30 on hand, already living in a couple of my amps. I wanted to consider some other speakers, so I did a ton of research online, listening to many sample clips before deciding what to purchase. Jensen ended up bubbling to the top of my list because they make it very easy to listen to comparable samples through all the different speakers, whereas some other companies either have few or no online samples or samples that are so random and processed that it makes comparison difficult. With that in mind, I ended up with the following set of speakers. 2 neodymiums from Jensen's Jet series, the Tornado Classic 100 and the Tornado Stealth 65, 2 Alnicos, the Weber 12A125A and the Jensen Jet Blackbird 40, and 3 ceramics, the Jensen Jet Nighthawk 75, the WGS Reaper, and my 30-year-old Celestion Vintage 30. It's important to note that given the age of the Vintage 30 and how broken in it is, its comparison might not be totally fair, but I still wanted to include it because it's a well-known, popular model. It would have been fun to consider even more options, but honestly, too much selection does not make the decision process any easier, so this seemed like a good place to stop. I wanted to make sure that I threw a variety of different tones at each speaker, so I recorded 4 sample tracks, each about a minute long. 2 of them were clean tones, and 2 of them were overdriven tones, and I recorded using what I guess you could say are the 4 canonical guitar pickup examples: single coil Strat, single coil Tele, P90s, and humbuckers. It's probably a little strange that I opted to go with the humbucker for the cleanest tone, but my rationale was actually that the Tweed Deluxe was really made to be more of a Fender-style amp, suited best to Fender-style guitars, and I know from experience that throwing over-the-top signal into the front end of this amp is really not what it was meant for. For those who are interested in the details and are familiar with the Tweed Deluxe, these are the settings that I used for recording each of the 4 samples. A couple of things to note real quick are the cathode bypass and negative feedback settings. These are both for mods that I've done to this amp. A stock amp would have a 25 microfarad capacitor in the cathode bypass for V2A, as I used in sample C. And the stock amp has no negative feedback, as was the case for 3 of the 4 samples I recorded. I talk about these mods at the very end of the video if you're interested in learning more about them. I did try out a couple of different preamp tubes as well, since that's an option on this amp. For the first 3 samples, I used a 12AY7 as the first gain stage, which is the stock 5E3 design, but for sample D, which was the most hard rock example, I used the 12AX7, which is a common substitution, to boost the gain even further. You'll also notice that I used an outboard attenuator to reduce the overall volume. These settings produced about the same listening level for the respective amp settings, which in all 4 cases was pretty loud, even with the 94% attenuation of the power. This was to make sure that the neighbors didn't call the police and that my wife did not kill me. And to be honest, she almost did anyway. Okay, that's all the background. Let's get on to listening to these speakers. Quick summary of Sample A. In my opinion, all of the speakers sounded fantastic on this cleanest of tones. I did put them in a rank order here, but even the bottom of the list was still completely acceptable. If anything, I would say that the top 4 had a little bit more chiminess and sparkle, which was a good thing here, since we're talking about such a warm tone to begin with. The other 3 were a little bit smoother. For sample B, I would again say that there were no losers. Though there are definitely some differences that become more noticeable as the tone gets edgier, this track was mostly focusing on the low strings of the guitar and a droning quality, and for those sections I really felt that the Tornado and the Blackbird were the clear winners. On the middle section of the track, where the focus shifts to the higher strings, the Alnico speakers got a little bit harsh, as did the Tornado, and the Reaper, Nighthawk, and Stealth 65 sounded a little bit less harsh. Overall, though, they were all acceptable. For sample C, we're now into the overdrive territory, and the differences between speakers became more pronounced. Again, most of the speakers performed at least acceptably, but I felt that the Reaper here fell into the borderline category, being a bit too harsh for this tone. That said, I did have the tone set on 10, and the guitar knobs all the way up, so you can always navigate around those kind of issues, but for the same settings, it was too harsh. I felt that the Tornado and the Blackbird, though very distinct from one another, were the winners here. Sample D was the hardest rocking track that I included, and once again I felt the Tornado and the Blackbird topped the list. The Stealth and Nighthawk also did very well with a smoother quality compared to the edgier or snarlier tones from the Tornado and the Blackbird. For this level of overdrive, I felt the Reaper was unacceptable. It was too harsh on the high parts, and it also lacked any of the, in my opinion, desirable low-end thump that the other speakers possessed on the thumpier parts of the track. In the next section, you can listen to short 1 to 2 bar snippets rotating through each of the speakers to really get a quick perspective on how the speakers differed. I would love to see your comments if you agree or disagree with the conclusions I drew. It's actually pretty hard to decide better from best, although it's pretty easy to decide good from bad. To wrap up, I wanted to create a kind of scorecard for my perceptions of what I heard. I reviewed all my rankings from each speaker in each sample. I awarded 1 point for any sample where a speaker scored a rating of acceptable, 2 points when a speaker was, in my opinion, a standout for that particular sample, no points if it was borderline, and then I actually subtracted a point if it was unacceptable. It's great that most of the speakers performed well across most of the samples. Interestingly, I did another speaker shootout a few weeks ago using a different amp with different sample tracks, and I saw much more variation in how well these speakers performed. There were much more different flavors of overdrive used in that shootout, which probably explains the difference. As you probably guessed based on my earlier comments, I felt that the two winners were the Jensen Blackbird 40 Alnico and the Jensen Tornado Classic 100. And I would probably have to give the top nod to the Tornado because it was always either number 1 or number 2 in my stack ranks. This was interesting to me and kind of exciting because the Tornado didn't perform quite so well in the other shootout that I did with a different amp, so it really goes to show you that a different amp may really match well with a different speaker. It's not surprising, but it's good to see in practice. So to conclude the shootout, I would say that either of these would be a super great fit for a Tweed Deluxe. Which one you choose really depends on your preferences. If you know you like vintage Alnico sound, I would go with the Blackbird because it delivers on that, and in my opinion, much better than the Weber did. And if you're less of an Alnico fan, I would go with the Tornado Classic 100. Both of these speakers are very lightweight, less than half of the weight of the ceramic speakers tested, and both should fit very well into a Tweed Deluxe, even if you have a smaller cabinet. All that said, I'd feel comfortable recommending any of the 7 speakers except maybe the Reaper. So if you're happy just to hear the shootout and move on with your day, you can sign off now, but I'll spend a few more minutes of the video walking you through the 4 mods that I've done to my Tweed Deluxe, some of which were on showcase in this shootout. So as I said at the beginning, the Tweed Deluxe is a classic amp design, albeit a rather peculiar one given the way the 2 volume controls interact with one another regardless of whether you're using the normal or bright channel. This amp is probably the most common kit amp for builders, and it's also extremely popular for doing all kinds of mods. Many, if not all, of these mods have been described in great detail on Rob Robinette's website, which is a great resource for learning about this amp and about tube amps in general. So here's the inside of my Tweed Deluxe. Let me walk you through 4 mods that I've done. Starting with what I consider to be the most useful of all the mods I've done is the switchable cathode bypass capacitor for the second gain stage of the amp. The stock version of this amp has a 25 microfarad cathode bypass capacitor, which provides a pretty full spectrum boost to the preamp gain. Often people add a switch to remove that cathode bypass capacitor, which tames the amp a bit. I've got that on the middle position of this on-on-on DP-DT switch. And then on the third position of the switch, I include a cathode bypass capacitor, but of a much smaller value, about 80 times smaller. This shifts the frequency range of that gain boost to only affect higher frequencies. So you still get a gain boost, but instead of affecting essentially all guitar tones, it adds kind of a top-end boost. Given that the cathode bypass capacitor is in parallel with a 1.5K resistor, the stock capacitor value of 25 microfarad would boost everything over about 4 Hz. Given that the low E on a guitar is 82 Hz, this means the stock value basically boosts everything. The smaller capacitance of 0.33 microfarads will boost signal for anything over 320 Hz. That's pretty close to the frequency of the high E string. So there's a big difference there, but even for lower notes on the guitar, you'll still be getting the boost of the harmonics in the signal. I use this mod all the time, based on which guitar I'm using. It can be good for providing more drive for single coil pickups in its stock position, or more drive for humbuckers without mud in its reduced capacitor value position. It can be used to make the amp somewhat cleaner by setting it to no cathode bypass. The second mod I did is another very common one for the Tweed Deluxe, probably the most common. That is to change the values of the first AC coupling capacitor after both the normal and bright channels. The stock value of 0.1 microfarads is often stated as contributing to the flabby tones that this amp is sometimes criticized for. For clean tones, the low end that you can get from the amp is pretty amazing, but at higher gains, it's not helping matters. A common value to use is 0.022 microfarads, or about a fifth of the stock value. So I started off with this mod for both channels, and then I decided I liked the idea of actually having the option for deeper tone, so I added a little capacitance back to the normal channel, piggybacking a 0.047 on top of the 0.022 for a total of 0.069 microfarads. That's almost the stock value, just a little bit smaller. This means that now, taking into account the fact that the bright channel was already brighter, I've got even a little more variety. Normal is a little less bright and a little deeper. Bright is the opposite. It seems like a decent compromise. The third mod I did is a variation on a very common mod, which is to add negative feedback to the amp. If you're not familiar, negative feedback takes a portion of the signal that reaches the speaker jack and feeds it back into one of the preamp stages, but inverted 180 degrees out of phase, meaning that you're subtracting from the signal. The effect of this is to tame the amp's overall gain a bit. Typically this is done using a fixed value resistor through which the signal is fed back. For Tweed Deluxe, this might be 22K or 56K or something in that general ballpark. And the mod is usually done via a switch, where in one position the connection is broken, so you have no negative feedback, just like the stock 5E3, and in the other position the negative feedback is engaged, taming the amp. I decided to get fancy here, and I used a potentiometer instead so that I could adjust the value of the negative feedback. And I decided to get even fancier, remembering that for guitar tone controls, people sometimes use what's called a no-load pot. What a no-load pot does is that when you're at its highest resistance value, instead of just being a high resistance, it's actually a completely open circuit, just like an off switch. So that's what I used here. But because these no-load pots are typically 250 kiloohms, that's what I've got there. So given that anything over 100 k ohm for a negative feedback resistor really has minimal effect anyway, I've got this potentiometer that only has noticeable effect on the sound when it's on a lower portion of its control range. I can tell myself that it's theoretically superior because I can dial it completely out of the circuit, but nobody on earth except me would know the difference. If I had it to do over again, and I still might do it over again, I would probably just do an on-off switch with a fixed resistor and call it good. Furthermore, finding and turning this knob where I positioned it under the chassis is hard, and I can never remember which direction is more or less. Another quick note about the negative feedback is that if you have the cathode bypass capacitor in the circuit, the effect of the negative feedback is greatly diminished even when it's engaged. Rob Robinette knows this, and his version of the cathode bypass mod actually combines the negative feedback with it on the same switch, so that you introduce the negative feedback simultaneously with removing the cathode bypass capacitor, though then you're really doing a double whammy on the gain with both of those happening at the same time. All in all, negative feedback is a useful mod, but I wish I'd kept it simpler. You'll also notice, perhaps, that I jettisoned my extension speaker jack in order to use the hole there for the control. For me, that didn't matter, but still, it wasn't a great design decision. The last mod I'll talk about is adding a master volume to the amp. This has been a constant struggle for me with this amp. One of the biggest problems with the Tweed Deluxe is that despite it being supposedly not a very high-power amp, I mean it's only 15 watts, the way the amp is designed, the volume sort of kicks in at an already loud level, even at a volume of only around 3 or so, and the amp isn't really on at all until you get around 2 or so. Then between 2 and 4 it goes from not really on to too freaking loud. It doesn't actually get dramatically louder above 4 or 5, at least not perceptually, but it gets more and more saturated from there. So good luck playing this amp at home without annoying everyone. So Master Volume seems like a great mod, right? Well, many of the Master Volume mods that I found online, particularly on Rob Robinette's site, do reduce the volume of the amp, but not at all in a linear way. Even with the recommended potentiometer types, the volume only starts to get quiet when you've got the Master Volume down to 2 or 3, and then there's not much more control, and you're down to 0. After discussing this with a few people in the forums who know much more than I do, it was suggested to just use a simple voltage divider type master volume before the phase inverter, instead of combining the control as a dual-purpose grid leak resistor. The mod does include both a separate grid leak and grid stopper resistor on V2B, which is the phase inverter. This version of the master volume actually does what I came to expect from better master volume controls I've used in other amps. It's pretty linear and has a smooth decrease in the output. I'm honestly not sure why this isn't the recommended implementation for master volume. So you're probably wondering why I'm not really giving it a raving thumbs up. Well, even though it's linear, which is good, it does change the character of the amp a lot as you dial it down. Compared to some amps that are designed such that most of your grit comes from the preamp and then the power tubes just faithfully pass it on, a lot of this amp's grit, and thus mojo, comes from the 6v6 power tubes. If you dial down the signal that's going into them, you're depriving yourself of that stage's saturation. It's not a deal breaker, but if you're hoping you can get ZZ top tones at bedroom levels using master volume, that's not going to happen. That brings me to the final so-called mod, which isn't actually a mod to the guts of the 5E3 amp itself. The mod is an attenuator box that you can put between your amp's output and your speaker. Now, of course, I could buy one of these. There are plenty of popular ones out there, some of which are inexpensive and some of which are rather insanely expensive. But since I enjoy trying to build things like this, I searched and found that Guitar.com had design plans for what looked like a really nice one based around a variable resistor called an L-pad. Before I went all in on this and built the thing, I wanted to know if it would at least work in an acceptable fashion, so I just bought the L-pad and wired it up, shall we say, a bit precariously. And it worked exactly like you would hope. Since the attenuation is happening after the amp, the tone of the amp is completely preserved and passed onward, only it's attenuated. They noted that there can be some extra attenuation of high frequencies when attenuating to the lowest volumes, which is why they include this treble switch in their design, which I also included in mine. It allows some highs to sneak around the attenuator so that your signal doesn't get too dark. To my ears, I actually didn't think the high end suffers too much, even when it's quite attenuated. The only thing the attenuator deprives you of as you turn down your signal would be any breakup from the speaker itself. Since I'm running a 15-watt amp into speakers that are rated at least 30 watts, in some cases double that or even triple that, I don't imagine that there was a ton of speaker breakup happening anyway, but for certain amp and speaker combinations, this is one thing you'd need to keep in mind with a design like this. Given that I was happy with the tone from my rat's nest of wires, I went ahead and ordered all the proper parts to build this, and I built roughly the design that was shown on Guitar.com. The rat's nest version is what you heard on the samples in this video. Okay, that's all I've got. I hope you found this video useful. Feel free to leave comments or questions. Thanks a lot, and have a great day.